Okay, so it's my great pleasure right now to introduce my friend HUI, who's an associate professor at the School of Creative Media at the City University in Hong Kong. And Yuk is going to make a talk on a very important topic, which is the regime of planetarity. So again, let's thank Yukui for his presentation now.
So first of all, I would like to thank the invitation of Bruno and Martin to speak here with you during this special event, a special day. The title of my intervention is For a Planetary Thinking. So the question of the planetary and planetarization is our focus. I will start with a reflection on Heidegger, what Heidegger called planetarization. If philosophy has been completed by technological planetarization today, according to Martin Heidegger, or more recently by many other authors after him, proclaiming a historical turn indicated by what is called planetary computation, then it remains our task to inquire into the possibility of thinking after what Heidegger has proposed, to search for the other beginning under Anfang. In this other beginning, or in plural form, in these other beginnings, human Dasein acquires a new relation to being and a free relation to technology. Heidegger's repositioning of thinking by returning to the Greeks seems immediately reactionary. Because one should doubt if this stepping back to the Greeks is sufficient to confront the planetary situation that he himself has described. This planetarization for him implies a planetary lack of sense-making, Besinnungslosigkeit, which is not limited to Europe, but is also applicable to America and Japan, as he said. This is even more obvious today, even if European philosophy completely reinvents itself. The disruptive technologies of the USA and China will not alter their speeds and paces. Any proposal to return to the question of being, Seinsfrage, may immediately appear to be embarrassing, if not ridiculous. It is not because Europe is too late, but because it arrived too early and has no longer control of the planetary situation that it has started, like what Heidegger said about the other meaning of the term end of philosophy. In the End of Philosophy and the Task of Thinking, published in 1964, I quote, "The beginning of the world civilization based upon Western European thinking." End of quote. This term, planetarization, is to a large extent interchangeable with the term globalization, or what Bruno Latour calls it more exactly, more explicitly, globalization minus, which is not an opening but a closing down of various perspectives and possibilities. Globalization has appeared as a blurring of borders, opening to the others, facilitating flows of capitals and material. However, this is largely driven by economic consideration, namely the desire to conquer market. The conquest of market firstly came together with the conquest of land, as we see in history. The trading and colonization are deeply intertwined. When land, sea, and air are appropriated and well circumscribed by borders, which is an indicator of modern nation-state as the sole post-colonial reality. The conquest of market becomes the only way that colonization takes form. Modern diplomacy adds ring to this process by means other than direct military invasion, namely soft power or culture. The conquest of market means primarily a faster and smoother mobilization of material goods and capitals, which necessarily create trade deficit and surplus. Globalization after the Cold War has greatly accelerated mobilization until today it becomes unbearable for the civilization and for the planet. Imagine a country had almost 50% increase of population from less than 1 billion to 1.4 billion in just 40 years' time. How much exploitation of land, sea, and humans were necessary to accommodate this increase in population and consumption. On the other hand, on the other side of the globe, in the past 40 years, the deforestation in the Amazon has rapidly increased by 16%. How many species have disappeared permanently? Globalization means mobilization and exhaustion of resources within the reach of the human species towards maximum acceleration. To maintain this geopolitical order, some stakeholders even denied that climate change, ecological crises have ever taken place. This form of mobilization exhibits what Heidegger calls Gestell, or enframing, the essence of modern technology, according to which every being could be regarded as standing reserve, Bestand, or resource submitted to calculation. Gestell expresses itself as kinetic politics, which the German philosopher Peter Sloterdijk describes as the key characteristics of modernity. Sloterdijk associates this kinetism with total mobilization, a term that was notoriously used by Ernst Junger to describe the wartime kinetics. The total mobilization expresses itself in terms of availability and accessibility of material, informational, and financial goods today. The realization of the world as a globe, as a frictionless globe, is a continuous metaphysical project since antiquity. Being complete in modern technology doesn't mean that one smoothly shifted into a post-metaphysical world, free of metaphysics. On the contrary, this metaphysical force never loses its grip on the fate of the human. It remains to be constantly asked, where is it going? Or where does it desire to go? I have argued elsewhere that globalization, which has been celebrated as a unilateral process of colonization, is confronting a Lord Boltzmann dialectics in the sense of Hegel. Over-dependence on a particular country in terms of both factory and market finally leads to the subversion of the Lord Boltzmann relations. This, which is happening right now, could be easily interpreted as the end of globalization, since the West has to reposition itself and reorganize its strategies by localizing and isolating the threat. Globalization might have come to an end, not because there has been an anti-globalization movement, but rather as a historical stage. It exposes more defects than the benefits it promises. This contradictory and confrontational moment is not yet resolved, or better, reconciled in the Hegelian sense. The German word for reconciliation, used by Hegel himself, Versöhnung, expresses fully this process. One will have to recognize the Father and to identify himself as the Son. No matter who will be the Son in this drama, the nature of kinetic politics may not change. The previous form of globalization will continue. This shift in power is only another promise to open the market. Therefore, more intensive planetarization and polarization, we are confronting an impulse which demands fundamental transformations of concepts, theories, and practices. The thinking of globalization is not planetary thinking, and that's the distinction between planetarization and planetary thinking. Global thinking is a dialectical thinking based on the dichotomy between the global and the local. It tends to produce twin monsters: imperialism on the one hand, fascism and nationalism on the other. A planetary thinking is primarily an imperative for diversities. The concept of diversity that has been the facade of globalization is based on the reduction of culture to technology-free rituals, social relations, customs, cuisines, and other forms of symbolic and aesthetic exchanges. Multiculturalism is based on the modern assumption of the separation between, on the one hand, technology and nature, on the other hand, technology and culture. Nature, insofar as it is conceived as merely external environments or non-human-made entities, we immediately enter into a dialectics of nature, through which nature will be mastered. Namely, it is logically comprehended nature and fully compatible with modern science and technology. Diversity in multiculturalism promised by globalization is far away from being the true diversity that one could appear to, since it is based on homogeneous concept of nature and technology. So you have this, you have a homogeneous nature and homogeneous technology, and on top of that is culture, or cultures. This is why Eduardo Vieiras de Castro, through his research in anthropology, especially Amerindian perspectivism, proposes multinaturalism in contrast to multiculturalism. For the former, multinaturalism affirms a multiple natures, while the latter is built upon the modern concept of homogeneous nature. However, I would like to add to that is that without reopening the question of technology, we will still be trapped in a system maintained by positive feedback loops whose goal is total mobilization. Therefore, a planetary thinking is not about mere acceleration, but diversification. It is conditioned by the planetarization, while at the same time summoning our efforts to go beyond it and transform it. We may schematically describe the three notions of diversity that constitute what we call planetary thinking, namely biodiversity, neurodiversity, and technodiversity. Biodiversity is fundamentally a question of locality, defined by a specific geographical milieu, as well as maintained by the particular relations between humans and non-humans. The multiplicity of relations firstly expresses a new diversity, and secondly, these diversities are inscribed and mediated through technological inventions, which is the constitutive part of what we call the people, including, for example, rituals, customs, use of tools. Therefore, we would like to emphasize that both biodiversity and new diversity are increasingly dependent on technodiversity. Since without technodiversity, we only have rather homogeneous ways of dealing with the non-human agencies and the world itself, as if homogeneity means universal. If we take technology to be neutral and universal, then we would just repeat what Arnold Toynbee said last century regarding the naive importation of technology of the Asian countries in the 19th century. Toynbee raised the question, why did the Asian refuse the Europeans in the 16th century and allow them to enter the country in the 19th century? The difference is that the European countries only export technology but not religion in the 19th century. And the Asian countries thought that technology is something that if they master, then it's all fine. They can still keep their thought. Now, the same passage from Toynbee was quoted by Carl Schmitt to describe how the technological advancement Industrial Revolution led to the domination of the maritime Dasein. I quote Schmitt, "The East must allow itself to be developed by us." The notion of noosphere, because we are talking about new diversity, was proposed by Teilhard de Chardin. Events to result in a superbrain, culminated after thousands of years of technological envelopment on the surface of the globe. Evolution means here westernization, because according to Teilhard, the East is anti-time and anti-evolution, while the Western way is a way of convergence, including love or progress, synthesis, taking time as real and evolution as real, and recognizing the world as an organic whole. End of quote. From a religious point of view, Teilhard de Chardin's noosphere means to be a Christogenesis, a universalization of love. From a technological point of view, it is the universalization of a set of particular epistemologies. The superbrain, or the brain of our brain, today is appropriated by the transhumanist. It is the witness of the realization of kingdom of God on earth, but also the triumph of evolutionary and progressive thinkings, which is identified with the West. The culmination of the noosphere is certainly not diversification, and this is where we are going, in fact, but rather a convergence mistaken as the Christian universal love, other one. The noosphere has to be fragmented and diversified, and such fragmentation or diversification can only be possible when we are able to take the diversity of thinking and the thinking of technodiversity further. Planetary thinking is not about the preservation of diversity, which posits itself against the external destruction, but rather it is about the creation of diversity. This diversification is grounded in the recognition of locality, not simply to preserve its traditions, though they remain essential, but also to innovate in accordance to the locality itself. We, the territorial beings, have always already landed, but it doesn't mean we know where we are, where we are going. We are disoriented by planetarization, like looking the Earth from the moon. We no longer notice the land until under our feet. Since Copernicus, the infinity of space stands as a great void. This insecurity and nihilistic tendency was countered by the Cartesian subjectivity, which returns all doubt and fears to man himself. Today, the Cartesian meditation is succeeded by the celebration of the Anthropocene, the return of the human to the center of the earth after having been, I quote Nietzsche, rolling from the center towards X, end of quote. The infinity of the space now means the infinite possibility of exploitation of resources, and humanity has already fled the earth towards dark matter of which we know virtually nothing. Diversification is the imperative for planetary thinking to come, and it demands a return to the earth. Planetary thinking, though emphasizes on diversity, is not nationalist thinking. Instead, it must go beyond the limit already set by the concept of nation-states and its diplomacy. What is the finality of the existence of a people or a nation? Is it only the revival of a proper name? This is how diplomacy expressed itself in the past decades, since the past century, since the nation-state became the elementary unit of geopolitics. Diplomacy has been based on a strong national interest and nationalist sentiment, and led to the denial of the ecological crisis and the global spread of the pandemic. Therefore, paradoxically, the sudden affirmation of the crisis, ecological crisis, could also come out of a diplomatic necessity. The nationalist sentiment is not nurtured by economic growth and military expansion, which is seen as the only way to defend against the threat from outside. A new diplomacy has to arrive, and it is an epistemological diplomacy grounded on the project of techno-diversity. This new diplomacy is more likely to be initiated by knowledge producers and intellectuals than diplomats who are becoming more and more consumers and victims of social medias. Planetary thinking is not Zen enlightenment or Christian revelation. It is a recognition that we are and will remain in catastrophes. God has already passed his power to man, and man passed it to machines. What could be done is to develop new design, practices, and knowledges, from agriculture to industrial production, not in service of the industry, but rather capable of transforming the industry. This equally prompts us to question the role of universities today beyond being talent factories for technological disruption and acceleration. It is through this initiative we can develop a true techno-diversity beyond traditionalism and industrialism. This restructuration of knowledge and practice has to be understood as concretization in the sense of technological and material realization. Biodiversity, neurodiversity, and techno-diversity are not separated domains, but closely intertwined and mutually dependent. Planetarization will probably continue for a relatively long time, and will probably not be awoken by the irreversible miseries, because it could be another moment of vanity for the human to affirm himself as the tragic hero. We will have to urgently initiate a new diplomacy, as we are discussing today with Bruno and others, in favor of techno-diversity, and this remains the task for a planetary thinking to come. Thank you very much for your attention.
It was really interesting about what you call, you hear us, Yuk? Hello?
Yes, I can hear.
You guess you do. And Bruno, do you hear us? Bruno? Okay. So, again, while Bruno is, while we're reconnecting with Bruno, great. Okay. Thank you for this, conference, which was initiating something very interesting about planetary thinking, quite close to what we've called in the context of the biennial, the planet globalization. And you were actually talking about the reference to Bruno's work on globalization minus as the contrary to, let's say, the extension of diversification, but rather a form of like homogenization. Bruno, would you like to ask a question to Yuk, maybe?
Yes, of course, because the show is a test of the possibility open by you on the possibility of shifting the technology toward what he called techno-diversity. So I'd like to ask, in what way can we tear apart, so to speak, the inventiveness of technology from the hegemony of technology? That is, how can we bring techno-diversity and biodiversity closer? I think you mentioned the locality. And that's, of course, very close from what we call terrestrial. So I'd like to know more about it.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so thank you very much, Bruno, for this question. And of course, this is a very difficult question because it involves how are we going to concretely carry out the possibility of techno-diversity. And I would like to go back to what I ended regarding what I called epistemological diplomacy. And I think that this is fundamentally about knowledge possession, exchange, and concretization of this knowledge in the modern world. But of course, the problem that we confront today, and this seems to be more and more the case, is that technological development is led ultimately by industrialization. But at the same time, our universities are providing talent to the industry who, after enter the industry, basically is like a business circle.
Yuk, maybe you need to
data
speak a bit
about
slower. Yuk.
about exploitation. So I think that the more fundamental to work on today is really to think about the kind of knowledge that we are producing at universities today. But as well, I think museums could be a site where forms of exchange of knowledge take place. But fundamentally, I think we have to change the maybe to even to think of the revolution within the universities, the structure, production of knowledge, and I think it is probably something we can still do, and it's possible to do.
Okay, thank you, Yuk, because these are our few, let's say, paths to develop that kind of new techno-diversity that you're talking about. And of course, it's a very interesting statement when you propose to say that this techno-diversity could become the very forms of diplomacy that we need in this new context. And you explain in an interesting way the fact that it's really a pathway that could be followed in order to enter into this kind of new diplomatic encounters that we're discussing today. And it was a short session, but we're going to have to end it, unfortunately. And I meet you in about 5 minutes, 10 minutes for the next round during the roundtable. Yuk, again, thank you very much for this intervention.